my name is Jim Vieira. I'm an author and world explorer and a student of ancient mysteries. And I wanted to continue my talk about the lost world of Edgar Cayce. I guess my orientation around this subject matter is one of comparative analysis. I take the Cayce material with secret society literature, the work of other mystics, the great chroniclers like Herodotus, Berosus, and Plato, religious documents and oral traditions, and I sift through all these different sources to find all these similarities about the past. And essentially the same story is being told by all these sources, that there was a continent that existed once in the middle of the Atlantic called Atlantis, that there were giants and little people as part of the population, along with the normal or the prototype that we are today, which is the normal size human. And in fact, our original state is talked about as being androgynous, like sexless beings at one point, and we've devolved in matter. Cayce and other esoteric sources, in fact, say that we essentially got trapped in matter in this world, in this planet, that we came in to have this experience and we were enamored by the materialism around us. And here we find ourselves today. And a lot of the sources like Plato talk about this isn't our home. Essentially, you wake up from this dream of separation. But in order to play this game of separation, you have separate bodies. And reincarnation is a big part of this. You keep coming back to this plane of existence. Now, it sounds a little new agey and esoteric maybe for some people, but this is what all these sources are essentially saying. So for me, I don't try to come up with some grand theory about history or the nature of the creation of Homo sapiens or our spiritual quest. I look at a comparative analysis that hopefully bypasses the human ego, because that's what I see as the enemy of logic and reason and truth, is when individuals, they have an agenda, they have desired outcomes. When they research things, they have confirmation bias, especially in the sciences. Like, I want to support this case, so I'm going to really keep fitting these facts that sometimes don't belong. So for me, I really like to bypass the human ego as much as possible and make this case through the eyes of the mystic or the shaman and gain some insight into our past. Because if you just read through academic journals and you know, the Western way of thinking, I don't think you'll ever get there. In fact, I think science is entirely built on a house of sand. The theories are backwards, I believe. There is no understanding of the holographic nature of the universe, the interconnectedness of everything that all the shamans and the mystics talk about. So I don't think that life was generated because lightning hit ammonia and then we gained consciousness at some point. I in fact think it's reverse, and there was a universal mind that created the entire universe of time and space. And I'm not alone in that thinking. The greatest teachers in human history basically promulgated the spiritual philosophy. So I'll turn to Cayce and we'll see what he has to say about the story of our past. Now, Cayce was born in 1877 in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, the son of a minister, and he would go into a trance-like state and basically tap into what he called the Akashic Records, which is the universal library that has a record of every event in the entire universe of time and space. It sounds like a far-fetched notion, but I think you'll soon see that Cayce, with his 8th grade education, tapped into the state and relayed a vast amount of readings that line up with these strange and esoteric versions of human history that have been talked about by a host of different disparate sources. So I'm going to roll through some of the evidence that Cayce talks about. Oh, first I have to give credit to my research partner, Linus the Cat. He's been with me for quite a while, many, many years, walking over my computer, eliminating files, and basically being a good buddy the whole time. So props to Linus. So what I found, in my attempt to figure out what the hell I'm doing, renting a body for 70 or 80 years, in this plane of existence and trying to figure out our past, I feel there's not an indifference to these alternative theories. There's a real like attack on them. You were considered, a nut job or a conspiracy nut or something like that when you entertain these things. Now, I just say, have an open mind. It's bad science not to view all these different ways of thinking and open-minded ways of thinking or perceptual shifts that might reveal a different paradigm. So, juvenile taboos, pseudo-archaeology, fringe ideas, and the mysteries of the collective unconscious I like to hit on for a minute. I've seen like this cottage industry of pseudo-skeptics arise as the alternative world has gained more and more fans and acceptance. The alternative versions of history. Now, in the alternative side, you don't have peer review. You have people with agenda who want to sell you books and ideas or be special and important by creating their own theories that don't have a lot of evidence to support them. But on the other side, much like religion and politics, you have an entrenched wing of people who don't understand, what the garbage means on this side of the aisle. And, I would say I prefer to meet in the middle and not try to make anybody wrong while I try to prove my case. So one of the things that has come about recently in the news is these new reports about, well, here's one from the New York Times, glowing auras and black money, the Pentagon's mysterious UFO program. Now, this is the report that recently came out last year where Harry Reid, the former senator from Nevada, hooked up with different defense contractors, and he was involved in this whole investigation of UFOs, or he was associated with it in some form or fashion. The new crack in official U.S. government policies of denials began on Saturday, December 16th, with the New York Times headline, Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's mysterious UFO program. The Times website contained a 34-second jet fighter gun camera infrared video of a UFO doing a rotation without losing altitude over the coast of San Diego, California during November 2004 training exercises. It was officially released by the Defense Department's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. So a lot has been made out of this footage and this story. And for years, we've been told that to look into these things is ridiculous. In fact, Robert Bigelow is I believe, a defense contractor associated with this story, and he came up with this term, juvenile taboos. There's a juvenile taboo about looking into the idea of UFOs or looking into alternative archaeology. Now, that doesn't make everything that an alternative-minded person says true, but the idea that you're somehow unhinged if you're looking into these ideas, I think is completely childish. In fact, one constant feedback I got as I moved away from where I grew up, south of Boston. I went to Western Massachusetts, and I started to get involved in esoteric teachings and holistic ways of thinking about life. And I would get, all my relatives and friends saying, I was in a cult, you were in a cult. Oh, you're meditating, that's like a cult. And I remember in the 70s, in the early 80s, running was still considered like this ridiculous activity. And then Jim Fixx came out with this book where he basically talked about the benefits of exercise and running. It's kind of like when Stonehenge was viewed as a site that had no astronomical alignments. And if you, in fact, looked at the site like that, you were considered a fringe researcher or a lunatic. And those words are thrown around like pejoratives all the time. And these juvenile taboos are pathetic in my estimation. Science is predominantly wrong about the theories of the past over and over again. So I ask, what does our modern science have wrong about the past? Now, I've talked about androgynous gods and these other strange ideas that Cayce and others have spoken about. And it's going to get a little stranger right now, because one of the ideas that Cayce talked about in his trance-like state was that hybrid creatures were created in Atlantis. Now, this island continent was supposed to exist between 210,000 BC through a series of destructions in 50,000 BC, 28,000 BC, and then finally the Great Flood that Plato and others talk about occurred in 11,600 BC. And at that point, the continent was destroyed, and survivors went to restart civilization in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world. So this is W.H. Church, a biographer of Cayce's. Many of those hybrid creatures of mythology, such as satyrs, centaurs, and the like, are said by Cayce to have inhabited the earth from the early days of progeneration in Atlantis, where they were known as things. So these kind of wizards of the black arts created these beasts of burden to like work in the fields. There was basically this story that sounds like science fiction that was related by Cayce, that all these myths and legends and ideas of hybrid creatures and centaurs was actually rooted in a distant reality deep into antiquity in Atlantis. Now, one of the things that Cayce said was that Atlanteans were the founders of ancient Egypt. He actually dates the Great Pyramid to 10,500 to 10,400 BC for its construction. And Thoth and Ra-Ta were the architects and grand designers of the Great Pyramid, which he claims was an initiation chamber. And he in fact says Jesus showed up 2,000 years ago and went through the mystery initiations when he was very young. So Cayce talked about temples being created to hail the appendages of these strange hybrid creatures in these temples in Egypt, these ones that date back to 10, 11,000 years ago. Now, once again, that seems quite odd, but I will continue and give other sources that corroborate this strange story. Here's a picture of the Great Pyramid. So Manly P. Hall, the great Freemason thinker, said this: "There is a profound mystery to the atmosphere and temperature of the king's chamber. It is of a peculiar death-like cold which cuts to the marrow of the bone. This room was a doorway between the material world and the transcendental spheres of nature. While his body lay in the coffer, the soul of the neophyte soared as a human-headed hawk through the celestial realms, there to discover firsthand the eternity of life, light, and truth, as well as the illusion of death, darkness, and sin." So Manly P. Hall is basically talking about this wasn't a burial chamber built by Khufu in 2750 BC. It was an initiation chamber that initiates would go to, and they would, just like Teotihuacan in Mexico, where gods become men, where men and women go and they try to become enlightened. They try to reach past the false belief in their separate self and the understanding that life is eternal, and you are just basically playing a game of separation here and renting a body, and we've forgotten this as we've become enmeshed in the material world. So some of the most ancient temple sites could be these places of hailing that Cayce talked about, like the Assyrian, and Robert Schock has redated the Sphinx to 10,000 BC, along with John Anthony West. So there's these ideas that there are ancient temple sites in Egypt. Now this is a very interesting passage right here by Berosus. He was the priest of Bel, and he wrote in 281 BC that Oannes, the fish god who showed up, who was androgynous, he showed up in about 3000 BC. He tells us, in ancient times when there was nothing but darkness and water, strange creatures were formed in the fluid, including men born with 2 wings and some with 4 wings and 2 faces, which had 1 body and 2 heads, and they were both masculine and feminine, androgynous, and they had 2 sets of sexual organs, male and female. So this is, I don't know who got the quote from the fish god, but this is what Oannes is supposed to have said, chronicled by Berosus, a well-respected temple priest of the time. So he's telling us this strange story that there were hybrid creatures created in the blackness in ancient times. Now here's a picture of our friend Oannes. He's a fish god, he is androgynous, he is carrying a strange man bag, but all around Egypt you find these portrayals of these creatures with 2 heads and 2 wings and 4 wings, just like was said by Berosus and just was talked about by Cayce. There are these strange hybrid creatures that are littered all around the world, you will see. And I don't know, how to make sense of them other than the story may have some truth to it. These centaurs and minotaurs and strange hybrid double-faced creatures are chronicled and then represented. So Eusebius, the priest of Caesarea, a couple centuries later, says this: "And they produced double-winged beings, and more people with legs of goats and horns on their heads, and others cloven hoofed, and more with horse bodies and human torsos. They have also wrought bull-headed men and even other monsters, whose images remain on the temple of Belos, one next to the other." So here is the temple of Belos right here. And this is what Eusebius was talking about. He is claiming that these 2- and 4-winged creatures and the goat men were literally a creation of these black magicians who ended up in Egypt and would go there to be healed of all these strange appendages. And it sounds bizarre, but then you have these kind of tough to decipher images of these creatures all over the place. In Samaria, you have Bazazu, this 4-winged demon, specifically noted by Eusebius and by Berosus, creatures coming out of the blackness with 2 wings and 4 wings. And here in Samaria, you find more of these creatures, these hybrids. Here's another from the Babylonians. Composite animals from the cylinder. So you ask, why are these strange amalgams of creatures being represented in ancient times in Samaria and other places? It's really telling some other strange story. The centaur, the minotaur, the labyrinth. What do those things mean? You find these creatures listed all over or portrayed all over the place. And oftentimes they're hybrids and they carry these strange man bags, which I will talk about. So you go to the other side of the Atlantic, and what you find is the Mayan winged ball player has a man bag and is a hybrid creature in Mesoamerica. Then you have this other hybrid creature with 6 fingers that was part of these cauldrons, from Syria to Anatolia to different places in ancient times, from like 1 to 2000 BC. Here you have Viracocha, the great god Viracocha, who is androgynous and is depicted as a hybrid being, having 6 toes. Here is another hybrid creature with 6 fingers, like a goat's-like foot, and wings. Here is a centaur, and in fact, when Theopompus relates the story to the king of Phrygia, Theopompus is a centaur, and he's a wise old centaur who taught, I think he taught Galen and all the physicians about the laws of health. And in history, it is noted that this strange centaur is the one that taught all these physicians how to heal others. And he's a hybrid creature, he's a centaur, and he has 6 fingers. So, once again, I'm Mr. Coincidence, not a coincidence, and that strikes me rather strange. We even have these stories in ancient Ireland and the British Isles where Balor shows up with these weird hybrid beings, this zoological nightmare, and he shows up after the flood. Now, Balor is represented or is portrayed as a giant who is a malevolent priest of Baal, and his name Balor speaks of this ancient tradition of black magicians. Cayce talked about there being the sons and daughters of light and the sons and daughters of darkness in ancient times, this ancient war between the 2 groups. And after the flood, these beings showed up everywhere and are often portrayed, in this manner. On Tory Island in Ireland, you have Balor's Tower. And Balor was the being who was supposed to have this one destructive eye, this weapon he used. All the beings who show up in the great Ulster Chronicles in the British Isles, they come with advanced weapons and metal flying ships or metal ocean-going ships. And a lot of Tolkien's mythology is based around these stories where the Twin Towers and the Lord of the Rings is associated with this. And I would say these ideas resonate with a lot of people. They don't seem as strange as you might imagine, because it's part of the collective unconscious. These ideas keep getting dredged up, and they strike people in a certain way. So I will say, after Cayce died at Qumran, they unearthed the Dead Sea Scrolls. And within the scrolls, a lot of what Cayce had to say about the sons and daughters of darkness and light are documented here. A large number of references to Belial, the Prince of Darkness, if you will, are evidenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1948. In the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Belial is the leader of the Sons of Darkness. So this is the character that Cayce talks about, basically creating these hybrid-like beings, being oriented around black magic. All these tales of sorcerers hark back to this lost world of Atlantis and all the dark magic that took place, and all the temple priests and the enlightened ones would battle against that. So Manly P. Hall says this: according to the secret tradition, it was during the later Atlantean epoch that black magic and sorcery dominated the esoteric schools, resulting in the bloody sacrificial rites and gruesome idolatry, which ultimately overthrew the Atlantean Empire and even penetrated the Aryan religious world. So, basically, I'm not conjuring this up to make a good fantasy tale. I'm just simply pointing to all these sources that talk about these strange occurrences. And these are unconnected sources in different eras from different locations. And in fact, Cayce talked about the original temples of Atlantis were built to sacrifice the separate self. They would have fruits and flowers be sacrificed, but really it was the human that would go there to sacrifice judgment and hatred and all the negative thinking. It was a tool of enlightenment to free you from your false belief that your enemy is external. As the Buddhists like to say, to judge another is to drink poison and wait for someone else to die. That is kind of an understanding of the holographic nature of reality taught by the great wisdom teachers. So Cayce is saying the same thing, but what happened was a lot of these sacrificial temples got turned into and corrupted, and they got turned into sacrifice cults, like with the Aztecs and some of the Maya stuff. So originally they had a benevolent purpose, and they turned very black. And in fact, when I think when the Aztecs were met, they were sacrificing between 20 and 30,000 people a year. So Madame Blavatsky, the great mystic, also has this to say. To continue the tradition, we have to add that the class of Hierophants was divided into two distinct categories: those who were instructed by the sons of God of the island Atlantis, and those who were initiated in the divine doctrine of pure revelation, and others who inhabited the lost Atlantis. Therefore, while the former walked the path of their divine instructors and acquiring their knowledge by degrees, learned at the same time to discern the evil from the good, the born adepts of the Atlantis blindly followed the insinuations of the great invisible dragon, the king Theavat, the serpent of Genesis, or Belial, as Cayce would say. Thus, under the evil insinuations of their demon Thevatat, the Atlantis race became a nation of wicked magicians. In consequence of this, war was declared, the story of which would be too long to narrate. Its substance may be found in the race, in the disfigured allegories of the race of Cain, the giants, and that of Noah and his righteous family. The conflict came to an end by the submersion of the Atlantis, which finds its imitation in the stories of the Babylonian and Mosaic flood. The giants and magicians and all flesh died, and every man, all except Xisthus and Noah, who were substantially identified with the Great Father and the Popol Vuh. So you have all these mystics and clairvoyants and secret societies talking about this lost world. And I think these ideas, like in Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, they really pique people's imagination. And, skeptics will kind of denigrate this idea like, oh, these people have to live in a fantasy world because they can't deal with the harsh realities of life or something like that. And I would say the reverse. It takes a lot of courage to really not accept these ideas, but even entertain them. You face ridicule and people don't take you seriously, but you're following your intuition. You're following, the wisdom keeper inside that is saying, I don't care how fucked up this sounds, there is truth in the story, and just go with it and see where it leads you. And don't give a rat's ass about what anybody's saying, Read, study, self-reflect, meditate, and see what is revealed through these ancient mystery teachings. So me personally, I always like, a good story, and I'll go anywhere, for it. And one thing I've done is met with a lot of shamans and wisdom keepers, and I've sat in long, very long ayahuasca and San Pedro ceremonies. I've listened to the wisdom of these ancient lineages and the wisdom keepers, and I basically hear a different story of the past, of the nature of reality, and of the nature of the human and the individual soul, or what is thought to be the individual soul. I hear a completely different story. When you do a ceremony like this, the shaman is the guide, the tour guide through the strange realm where the insidious nature of the human ego is put to sleep. So you're basically connected with something divine, and you receive all this download, if you will, of information. It's quite an experience, but it's a rough ride. You have to face all your hatreds and your judgments and your self-doubts. But essentially, you're able to get a clearer picture of reality. And that is what I found in my experiences there, And it's, like I said, it's not for the faint of heart. It's stop the ride, I want to get off oftentimes. But to the open-minded initiated, I would recommend trying different ayahuasca ceremonies and things like that. This is what Terence McKenna says. Psychedelics are illegal, not because a loving government is concerned that you may jump out a third-story window. Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally lay down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong. And that's been my experience, and other people I know who have experience with different psychedelics or different shamanic rituals. You basically get everything broken down, and you just revealed the truth. And then if you don't integrate it, you go back to your normal life and your ego reconfigures itself. Like the ego as in the sense of the thought of separation, the thought of you're over there and I'm here and we don't have a common source, that you're the cause of my problems, I'm going to judge you, I'm going to be a victim of the world, rather than I am creating the film I am seeing, like Plato's cave. So all the great wisdom teachers all throughout history are essentially saying the same thing. And one of my favorite and oddest topic that I like to get into is the one of man bags. Now these remember, Berosus and Eusebius and Oannes, they're talking about these creatures being formed in the blackness, so these black magicians or magicians of light, showing up. Oftentimes these beings are portrayed as benevolent, and they are teaching the arts of civilization. Sometimes they're portrayed as demons or malevolent. But they were always carrying this strange man bag in Samaria and other places. And I wanted to go through some of these examples. It's a very specific thing, this bag of wisdom, this, we don't know what's in the bag, but it's quite astonishing. And it dates back to the ziggurat of Ur and other places in Samaria. Well, it dates back there. I will show evidence that it shows up in other places as well at a earlier date. So Oannes, this fish being, remember, is supposed to teach geometry and mathematics to the Sumerians. So this cuneiform tablet was recently deciphered. So let me tell this story right here. That tablet is Plimpton 322, and this is what a researcher just said. Our research reveals that Plimpton 322 describes the shapes of right-angled triangles using a novel kind of trigonometry based on ratios, not angles and circles, Mansfield said. It is a fascinating mathematical work that demonstrates undoubted genius. Now, who is the one that showed up and spread this wisdom? it is specifically noted that Oannes, the fish god who is androgynous, carrying a man bag, taught this incredible geometry and mathematics to the Sumerian people. So this is what Berosus says. This is about Oannes. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and show them how to collect the fruits. And when the sun had set, this being, Oannes, retired again to the sea and passed the night in the deep, for he was amphibious. The being was accustomed to pass the day among men, but took no food at that season, and he gave them an insight into letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. So we have this freak show fish god showing up, and then we have verification of the mathematical genius and prowess of the Sumerians at the same time. Now I'm going to take it a step further to the constant of Nineveh. What is this number doing on a cuneiform tablet? So Sumerian clay tablets discovered by George Smith in the buried ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh in 1873 contain tables of an advanced astronomical data. One table contained a numerical constant, there you go, since called the Nineveh constant, recognized by French mathematician Maurice Chatelain. Here is a picture of the tablet. And here is the library of Ashurbanipal from 700 BC. And here are some of the tablets at the British Museum. So this is what Chatelain, who was a NASA scientist, also says about the tablet. That number represents every period of revolution or conjunction of the solar system bodies calculated by the constant of Nineveh corresponds exactly down to several decimal points with the values given in the modern tables of U.S. astronomers. I have not been able to find even a single period of revolution or conjunction of a solar system planet or satellite that would not be an exact fraction down to the fourth decimal point of the great constant of the solar system. The Nineveh constant is actually 70 times 60 to the 7th power. The number 60 is fascinating as it was the base number of the Assyrian mathematical system. We use a base 10 system. And there was some belief that the Sumerian gods had 6 fingers and toes, and that's why we get the sexagesimal mathematical system from them. You know, this whole idea is, once again, it's just a fascinating look into these advanced mathematics. And then you ask the people who literally were passed on this knowledge, and they don't say, oh, we conjured it up over centuries. It was given to us by this amphibious androgynous being who showed up and taught it to us and slept in the river at night. So once again, I'm not conjuring the story. I'm pointing to the bizarre but well-documented story here. So Chatelain was derided because he had ideas that humans might have been created by extraterrestrial sources. So a lot of this work hasn't really been analyzed like it should. But I'll continue with this constant of Nineveh. So the Mayans, famous for their now long count calendar, also used huge numbers. Found out the steles at Quirigua in Guatemala, one such calculation was just under 93 million years, and one equaled 403 million years. The first is 15 times larger than the Nineveh constant, and the second is 65 times larger. So they would represent 15 and 65 Nineveh cycles of this massive number. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, you have Quetzalcoatl and Vieira showing up, and they once again, they're androgynous, and they teach the arts of civilization and mathematics and geometry to the people who live there. You have the same story, the same outrageous math, and the same specific identification of these beings as androgynous and oftentimes aquatic. Here is the stela. The deep origins of the Maya calendars are still shrouded in mystery, but there is evidence that the Olmec were using both the Xulcan and the Hab calendars by the 7th century BC. Here it is right here. My friend Newman is Mr. Olmec, and he has studied the enigma of the Olmec and written about it and talked about it. And one interesting thing that Cayce says is he actually said that the Yucatan lands were a melting pot of different cultures. Now, there's a lot of controversy, about The Olmec heads, some people think they look clearly West African or Samoan. Cayce said there were beings from Atlantis and Lemuria in different migrations, and there was a melting pot in ancient Yucatan, and especially among the Olmec people. And you find these Asian-looking statues there too. So once again, Cayce throws out this wild idea in a trance-like state, and you find this strange verification. It appears that there were Asian-looking people who lived there. And you have these strange elongated skull beings who were found in the Olmec site. The wrestler clearly looks Asian and bearded. And then you find that Quetzalcoatl, the androgynous offspring of the androgynous god Ometeotl, has a man bag on the other side of the Atlantic. He is androgynous, like Oannes and like so many of these other beings. And, for me, it's beyond coincidence that this wisdom keeper who's teaching mathematics, geometry, and the arts of civilization is rocking a man bag. So here's a four-winged bird being with the man bag. Here are more of them from Anatolia. Here are some of the Oannes' crew, the fish beings with the man bag. And in fact, you find these everywhere with hybrid creatures on them. Back to the Giraffe culture in Iran, 3000 BC. Here I am shopping for man bags in the British Museum. Here's a hybrid creature on a man bag representing the God Self icon that I will get to in a minute, pioneered by Richard Cassaro, who is a researcher and occultist. My friend J.J. Ainsworth sent me this, that this hybrid being on a man bag has 6 fingers. Here's a hybrid creature from Colombia, 600 BC. He has his man bag and a crocodile head. Here is the winged ball player from the Mayan world. So you have hybrid beings on both sides of the Atlantic that bring wisdom that have these man bags. I think, that makes me stand up and take notice. I originally talked about androgyny, this idea that our original state was androgynous, and these creator gods who showed up after the flood are represented in the oldest statues on earth, like Ayin Ghazal and Jericho, as androgynous beings, sometimes male and female with 2 heads. I wanted to make the case that possibly at Göbekli Tepe, the oldest temple site in the world currently at 11,600 years old, shows signs of this androgyny. First of all, you have what appears to be 3 man bags at the super ancient site of Göbekli Tepe. And you have these kind of anthropomorphic beings whose hands meet in the waist. This is from Navali Chori, somewhat contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. You have the 2-headed Nomo, that is the Dogon's people's androgynous fish god from Sirius that showed up to teach knowledge, looking just like the statue found from Gaziantep in Turkey, which I think is dated around 5,000 or 6,000 BC. So this is what Eric Ziffer says, the academic from the University of Israel, in his paper, Ayin Ghazal and the 2-Headed Bus. I would like to suggest that these statues represented mythical ancestors from the dawn of mankind, and that the 2-headed bus among them represent the first human being, the androgynous prototype of humanity. And I've went over that Plato and the Rosicrucians and Freemasons and Steiner and Cayce all talk about androgyny being our first state. And then we were broken up into the male and female aspect. This is Catalhayuk in Turkey, 6000 BC, representing androgyny. And in fact, in 2001, Mark Verhoeven, an academic, looked at this statue found in Kilisik on the foothill of the Taurus Mountains, and he claims that these are androgynous beings. And this is contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe, over 10,000 years old. He says a vulva and a penis is represented here, and that this is an androgynous being, which really, begs the question, are the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe representing this? So here is a hybrid creature from the Sanliurfa Museum. Once again, the oldest temple site in the world is displaying hybrid creatures, and they're giving birth to some kind of human-like being in some strange fashion. is this nature of hybrid beings and androgyny being portrayed here. You know, what I can tell you right here is Navali Chori, here is Göbekli Tepe, there is Urfa Man, which is over 10,000 years. But look at the crooked arms and the iconography. So we have an androgynous statue that's been verified by an academic, and now this is what we have at Navali Chori and Göbekli Tepe. It seems like these same beings are being represented. That this creator god cult at Göbekli Tepe, these beings who showed up after the flood, basically are being represented as androgynous beings, and oftentimes with 6 fingers and 6 toes, and many times as aquatic beings as well. So here is Urfa Man with this position, you know, of the gods that you find in Easter Island, across the navel. Here is Kilisik. And here is, in Indonesia, a series of megaliths. This guy's clearly not androgynous, but he is, he's representing some kind of godlike figure, I'd imagine. And this is a phenomenal ancient piece of stonework. You see the carving on this particularly hard stone, and these monoliths are littered around Indonesia. Another example of these ancient sites representing some godlike figure. Now, the 7-headed serpent is found all around the world and is used to identify this ancient religion, the Law of One, that Cayce and others talked about, I believe. And it represents the chakra system that the Hindus use of enlightenment through the energy channels that are in the body. So anyways, here we have a 7-headed serpent. He has a man bag. He is this weird hybrid amalgam, and he has fish scales as well. So on the other side of the ocean, there is a weird amalgam of all these traits baked into the cake. My friend Richard Casaro has found evidence of this lost religion called the Law of One, and what he calls the God Self icon, found all around the world. In fact, they just found a new one in India, and this was the account from BBC. The discovery of rock carvings believed to be tens of thousands of years old greatly excited archaeologists who believe they hold clues to a previously unknown civilization. So this lost ancient Indian civilization is representing the God Self icon, like the androgynous Vieira and many other androgynous beings, like Zurvan and many others. So Richard has pieced together this research which shows just how ubiquitous this God Self icon is all around the world. Now, esoteric traditions that talk about Atlantis and giants and floods and androgyny also kept alive this God Self icon and this idea of the perfected self all throughout the Dark Ages. They hid them in these esoteric meanings that people have trouble deciphering. But I think, you know, the reality is that it's pointing to an ancient religion of the Law of One. And here Casaro points out, you know, at these 2 temple sites, you have the God Self icon in Egypt and in Peru, and then you have these kind of pillowing, knob-shaped stone constructions. Now, you find megalithic similarities, iconography all around the world that is similar. You know, that's what catches my attention, is that, you know, basically the world is littered with the strange and specific when it comes to the question of human origins and how these ancient peoples described what went on in the past. Now, it sounds like somebody slipped me a hit of acid. I know that, and I'm not asking you to swallow all this. I would just say, you know, does it ring true to you? Can all this be, you know, conjured up as some kind of fanciful hoax or a mythological tale that has no basis in reality? Remember, these great chronicles talked about it. Like, you know, androgyny and man bags and fish beings are everywhere. And, you know, I'm just trying to piece it together and point to the great chroniclers and the secret societies and piece it all together. This version of history answers most of the questions regarding the enigma of myth and legend. Modern science answers none of it. You know, that's what I feel, is that modern science doesn't approach any of these problems. It's not like, this is what was really going on. This is what these people were thinking. You know, I find that there is a different version of history that is really, it's denigrated and belittled, so you don't have a lot of wherewithal to get into these realms unless you just really don't give a rat's ass. And you're like, I could never be an academic with my orientation, I wanted to be an archaeologist and anthropologist. I ended up being an economist and a stonemason, but I just couldn't pull it off, talking about these strange ideas. And it is what it is. I'm not going to cry about it and write a blog from my parents' basement, but at the same time, I feel like there is a resonance to this information. And there is a spiritual underpinning as well about the nature of time and space. Plato talks in depth about what is happening here and the nature of time and space, and that this place isn't our home. It's in a weird, basically shadows on a cave that we're experiencing because we're playing this game of separation here. And when you really read all this information and contemplate it, it starts to ring true in an intuitive sense for some people. There are people that are like, wow, that really makes a lot of sense, and people just aren't even going to pay attention to this, and I understand that. And I'd be a hypocrite to disparage anyone, because I used to be really closed-minded and really run my mouth about that's impossible, extraterrestrials, that's an idiotic idea. So, I'll shit on myself, my past self, and I'll say, I just hope people are open-minded about this type of what I find fascinating information. So thank you for listening. I hope I didn't freak you out too much, and thanks.